Right, so welcome everybody to this next edition of the colloquium. Our speaker today is Dr. Rob Adam, and I mean, you must know him quite well as the managing director of Cereo, but he has a kind of a long history in managing science and science in South Africa. So he was the director of GST when the whole SKA thing was started. So in that sense, he's kind of at the origins of the SKA South Africa project, and this Cereo position kind of represents a coming back home for him. But Rob is also a nuclear physicist, and he has managed a number of projects related to nuclear physics, which have had a very interesting history. And I think he's going to talk about that today. So as usual, we're going to ask you to please put your questions into chat so Rob can answer them after the talk. And with that, Rob, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Oleg. The talk I'm going to give today is based on a paper that I had published in, interestingly, a social science journal, Social Dynamics, last year. It's called Technology, Policy and Politics, Critical Success Factors in High Technology Infrastructure Projects. I'm just figuring out how to change my slides. What's it basically going to be about? Well, these are three projects: the Square Kilometre Array, the Pebble Bed Modular Reactor, and the Reactor Conversion Project that I've been very intimately involved in at different levels, different roles over several decades. So these three rather complex projects illustrate well what mistakes can be made, both in the conceptualization and in the execution phases of projects. What I'll go over is to explain how the confluence of a range of diverse factors, such as simply getting something done, prototyping, managing your political stakeholders, understanding your market, getting the organizational culture right, and managing company ambitions and aspirations, how the confluence of these factors is necessary for success to be achieved. I don't need to explain this to you. I mean, I've given this talk, a different version of it, to others, and so that's why we've got these pictures of antennas up here, and those are the old pictures. Before the actual design happened, it was a conceptual view of what the SKA would look like. But it's an international effort to build the world's largest radio telescope, up to 50 times more powerful than any existing facility. Hundreds and eventually thousands of mid to high frequency 15-meter dishes will be located in South Africa and hopefully throughout the rest of Africa as well eventually. And then in Australia, hundreds of thousands and eventually up to 1 million low frequency antennas located in Western Australia. What was the Pebble Bed Modular Reactor, or PBMR as it became known? It's a smallish high temperature nuclear reactor using pebble fuel coated particles in graphite, cooled with helium and moderated by graphite, based on German technology and developed by South African company PBMR Pty Limited. What was the Reactor Conversion Project, or RCP? It was a project to convert the Safari research reactor, which was a research reactor which was donated by the United States government to South Africa in the early 1960s as part of the Eisenhower Atoms for Peace program. And the idea of the RCP was to convert this reactor from using weapons-grade uranium as fuel and for making radioisotopes, medical radioisotopes, to using low-enriched uranium for these purposes. Through the RCP, South Africa became the first country in the world to industrialize a low-enriched uranium route for this technology. It's a picture of the Safari reactor to the left with the beautiful blue Cherenkov radiation you can see, which you see in any nuclear reactor. These were three iconic high-tech projects with a South African footprint. All of them had excellent global value propositions, All of them had excellent local value propositions. My job today is to try and understand what went wrong and what went right in these projects. What was the global value proposition of PBMR? Well, to generate electricity, high temperature output over 900 degrees centigrade leads to more efficient electrical plants. Provide process heat, in other words, using the waste heat from the reactor as a carbon-free heat source for industries that require heat as part of their process. To provide high temperature steam, in other words, blow steam into oil sands. And there's one application. The Canadians were interested in it from that perspective. To generate hydrogen, not by electrolysis, but because of the high temperature, by catalytic cracking of water, thereby using the waste heat to transfer nuclear origin energy to transport systems. Desalination of seawater. There was also a safety global value proposition, which made the reactor very exciting to potential markets. Has thermal stability. The core can't melt or overheat beyond the fuel failure temperature, and I can go into the physics of that if anyone's interested later, but I won't do it right now. Nuclear stability, the transients won't lead to unacceptable power outputs. Chemical stability, fuel elements won't corrode excessively. Mechanical stability, the core won't change or won't deform or change composition, which all leads to the rather compelling overall diagnostic that the reactor cannot melt. There's practically no release of fission products. Effectively, you have catastrophe-free nuclear power. The SKA global value proposition, again, I'm preaching to the converted here. Transformational science. In other words, there's a very good science case for having an instrument of the size and nature. Excellent observing conditions in the Karoo. Affordable infrastructure. Although, in radio astronomy, you obviously want to be as far away as possible from people, you don't want to be too far, and because otherwise your infrastructure costs become exorbitant with power lines, fiber, etc., water. So the Carnarvon, Bruntvlei, Van Wyksvlei, Williston area of the Karoo makes a good compromise between being very far away from radio frequency interference, but not too far away from an infrastructure point of view. Available local skills. South Africa has sophisticated engineering and maintenance sector to ensure competent construction and operations. They have a cooperative host. The South African government sees SKA as the jewel in its research system. And good location in the south because of the astronomical richness of the southern skies. That's the compact of global value propositions. What was the case with the RCP? The business case, from a health perspective, to provide affordable nuclear medicine worldwide. 99% of the medical radioisotopes from Safari reactor get exported to the rest of the world. Combating nuclear terrorism, to contribute positively to a global nuclear safeguard system, particularly in a post-9/11 world. In other words, using low-enriched uranium rather than weapons-grade uranium enables that. Third, this is a great moral example to the world. It epitomizes the swords to plowshares technologies in that we are the only country in history to have voluntarily decommissioned its entire nuclear weapons inventory. Going on now to local value propositions. This is the PBMR one now. Local manufacturing, using PBMR design capability to stimulate a local high-tech manufacturing capability. addressing South Africa's so-called technology balance of payments, which is skewed very much to our detriment because of the technology that we import and the resources that we export, to capture an increasing part of the global supply chain for other nuclear power systems that will help address that technology balance of payment. Energy solution. PBMR promised a flexible load-following nuclear power solution in small modules, raising South Africa's game, the participation in a massive international engineering project with deliverables and deadlines, promoting high-quality human resource development too. So that's a strong attractor for us. And geopolitics, the existence of a home-designed nuclear reactor on the African continent indicates a powerful footprint of modernity on the African continent. What's the big data? Sorry, what's the SKA local value proposition? Well, big data, development of a South African capability in big data technologies, diversifying the economy of the Northern Cape, linking human resource development in South Africa with the best universities in the world, and then again, the raising our game and the geopolitics propositions as well, same as for PBMR. The Reactor Conversion Project, local high-tech production, creating an industrial platform for radioisotopes production using Nexa's legacy capability in strategic nuclear technology. Again, the technology balance of payments factor. Using medical technology to promote nuclear technology. In other words, to deliver a social dividend for nuclear technology in the health sector via the production of medical radioisotopes. Again, raising our game and geopolitics. Going on to the issue of prototyping now. What was the PBMR prototype? Well, there was a Pebble Bed type reactor located outside the Jülich Research Center in Germany. It was an indirect cycle machine. In other words, you had a primary coolant, which was helium, and the helium, through a heat exchanger, heated up steam, which drove a turbine, hence indirect. No South African prototype was planned or built. Instead, the decision was made to go immediately for a direct cycle commercial reactor. In other words, with a turbine driven by the primary coolant, namely helium. Various technology problems identified in the original AVR reactor were assigned to the in-tray of the PBMR Chief Technology Officer, assuming that they would be solved. PBMR went straight from the Jülich reactor to detailed commercial designs, which changed continually, causing regulatory delays and market uncertainty. In contrast, a very strong prototyping culture and practice is embedded in the SKA. In South Africa, we're already on the third generation of precursor instruments. We built a single dish, XDM, went on to Cat7, then on to Meerkat, learning as we went. Australia has ASCAP to bolster the Meerkat learning as well at mid-frequency. And in South Africa, we have HERA at low frequency. So there's been a fairly systematic and meticulous prototyping trajectory in the SKA. Similarly, in the Reactor Conversion Project, the Nexa and its commercial subsidiary called NTP, the staff involved there, they had a background of success in strategic nuclear projects, in uranium enrichment, weapons production, and fuel manufacture during a period of limited international contact and assistance. In other words, it was an indigenously developed competence. They had developed on their own, these professionals, the nuclear and chemical processes to produce the key medical radioisotope molybdenum-99 using high enriched uranium, and they understood very well the stepwise progression necessary for full industrialization of the low enriched uranium technology, which we were developing. This broad range of highly developed nuclear skills, where prototyping and stepwise industrialization were embedded in the engineering culture, this stood the project in very good stead. On now to the relationship of the three projects with government. Originally, it was Eskom that bought the rights to exploit the PBMR intellectual property. It was seen by the then Eskom management in the late 90s as a commercially viable project. In fact, all they said they wanted from government was the go-ahead. It was seen as having potential for international sales and local use. However, I guess because they got a bunch of accountants with sharper pencils, this view changed, and in 2003, the Eskom board voted to terminate PBMR work. What then happened was that the presidency under Thabo Mbeki intervened to ensure continuation of the project for strategic reasons. It was transferred to the DTI, Department of Trade and Industry, and later to the Department of Public Enterprises. Support outside these departments, particularly National Treasury, was much weaker, and not enough was done by the management of the project to broaden political buy-in from other ministries. In terms of other shareholders, investors other than government proper included Eskom, the Industrial Development Corporation, Westinghouse, and Exelon as foreign investors. However, no shareholder agreement was concluded because the SA government view was that South Africa should not give up hard-won IP. Of course, you keep the intellectual property rights, but you also keep all the risk as well if you do that. What's the SKA relationship with the government been in contrast? Well, DSI and DST was and is the anchor department. The SKA has prospered through 6 ministerial changes, remaining a flagship project. There's no minister that came in and dissed the work of his or her predecessor. They built on it, which is a model lesson for how to do long-term projects in government. Involvement of other departments, well, right from the beginning, key relationships were established with departments other than DST, particularly DIRCA, International Relations, and the Department of Communications, but even the intelligence services assisted us in terms of doing assessments of other African partner countries and fed this into the original bid that we put in one in 2012. Provincial governments, the Northern Cape and the Western Cape governments are strong champions of the projects, as are the local municipalities. The Reactor Conversion Project, how did it relate to government? Well, it had a political trump card in the very strong support it was able to garner from the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is based on the medical applications of nuclear technology, as well as the global nuclear safeguards improvements. As a result, because South Africa enjoyed the positive attention that it received from the International Atomic Energy Agency, local political support was never in question because we made them look good. Now, the RCP did not have the state funding that the PBMR had. In fact, it had largely to utilize its financial reserves built up over years through the sale of radioisotopes to finance the technology conversion of the reactor. But this kind of commercial viability was in fact a buffer against political caprice. Money buys you independence, particularly if it's your money. You don't have to ask permission for so many things if you're spending your own cash. What about the market? Starting with PBMR, in terms of understanding its own markets. Although it was highly suitable for smaller isolated towns in South Africa, it never featured in national energy planning. And the Department of Energy tended to regard it as an R&D project as opposed to an infrastructure rollout project. Eskom originally signed a letter of intent to buy 24 PBMR reactors. Not an MOA, but a letter of intent. Subsequently, they withdrew the letter and an offer was made to purchase just the first reactor for a nominal sum, as opposed to the actual value. After this disappointment, PBMR courted Sasol, proposing a process heat platform. In other words, reducing Sasol's carbon footprint by using nuclear origin heat as opposed to heat from coal. However, what they didn't get was that nowhere in the world were regulations in place for the co-location of chemical and nuclear plants. What happens if there's an explosion at Sasol and you've got a nuclear plant right next to it? That hasn't been addressed anywhere in the world yet. So those discussions petered out once Sasol realized that. Globally, at that point, kind of 10 years ago is what we're talking about, the major vendors were focusing on marketing their large generation 3 reactors, in other words, PWRs, etc. Small modular reactors such as PBMR were seen to be in the future. Regulators were also not ready. There was much talk in PBMR about suitability for Africa, which was also not ready from a regulatory perspective either. Talking about SKA and its so-called market, I mean, obviously one has to conceptualize a market rather differently in the case of the SKA as compared to a project which has commercial implications. But it's internationally, SKA has been prioritized by the international science infrastructure planning processes in a number of countries. And consortia consisting of over 100 companies from 20 countries were involved in technology down selection, and ultimately will be involved also in manufacture, construction, etc. Locally, there's been an ambitious human capital development program where well over 1,300 researchers and students have been funded to participate in SKA programs over the past longer now, more than 10 years, 15 years in South Africa. In the latest call for proposals from the international community, 19 successful proposals have South African PIs. And of course, this is related to prototyping. The good performance of the prototypes has whetted the appetite of the global radio astronomy community. Meerkat's performed well. Here is giving indications of good performance, ASCAP as well. What about the RCP in the market? Well, NTP, which is the commercial subsidiary of NEXA, had developed a reputation as a reliable supplier of molybdenum-99, as well as other radioisotopes over several years, was exporting to 55 countries using its internally developed so-called BU shielded container, which was licensed in 50 countries. In fact, NTP was one of the 4 top producers of radioisotopes in the world. There were diplomatic successes as well. The Canadian reactor at Chalk River, which was then the world's largest supplier of molybdenum-99, was shut down for major repairs in 2009. And South Africa was asked by the International Atomic Energy Agency and various Pretoria-based foreign ambassadors to step into the breach, which we could do to some extent, but we were already operating pretty much at full tilt. So this was obviously a big marketing success for us as well, being asked to step to do this work by the IAEA and the international community. So it was into a fairly receptive global market in 2010 that NTP was able to introduce its first batches of low-enriched uranium-derived molybdenum. The political and commercial dividends were immense. Here was the first country in history to unilaterally abandon its nuclear weapons program, now setting a new global safeguard standard in radioisotope production. So getting on now to the lessons from all of this. One of the first lessons in these big long-term projects is to get something done. Concrete needs to be poured as soon as practically possible. Unless your political sponsors have something to show to the public, they are unlikely to deliver you any new resources. This is, of course, strongly linked to prototyping, which gives the chance for many ribbon cuttings. You don't just launch the SKA, you launch Cat 7, you launch Meerkat, and you give your political principles something to crow about. The project leaders got this wrong with PBMR, where not a drop of concrete was ever poured. They got it right with the Reactor Conversion Project, and also I'm happy to say with the SKA at this point. Obviously the SKA is not finished yet, but there's still room for slips and trips. But up until this point, the right things have been done in terms of getting things done. This is linked to not skimping on prototyping, as I said a minute ago. It's necessary to separate R&D from construction. Otherwise, the product keeps changing. This is often something which scientists get you to do. They wake up in the morning and they thought of a bright new idea, and they come charging into your office saying, no, we shouldn't do it this way anymore, we should do it another way. The engineers, on the other hand, want to freeze the spec and get on with pouring the concrete. The regulators, if you change too much, will delay the project, asking questions about the changes and require new tests, resulting in major cost escalations. That's, in other words, if you have an ECP in all the time, then the scientific community says, well, what are you up to? The RFI footprint changes. In the case of nuclear, it's even worse. I mean, you have public safety issues potentially. So in the case of PBMR, in my view, this was the fatal error. Based on impatience and exemplifying the old adage, more haste, less speed. In contrast, both RCP and SKA have been models of patient progression from demonstration of concept to prototype to precursor to final product. Third lesson, understand your market. In the PBMR, there was a very optimistic and unfocused view of the market. Was it power generation? Was it process heat? Was it new small nuclear countries? Was it established nuclear nations? It was never clear. With the RCP, it was very clear. The market was the big United States radiopharmaceutical market, based on support from the US Department of Energy and the US National Nuclear Security Agency. Those particular entities are very keen to stop the use of weapons-grade uranium for industrial purposes. With SKA, the market is primarily the radio astronomy and fundamental physics communities, with the main spin-offs being in big data. Building multiple strong alliances gives any large project stability no matter what. In other words, don't only depend on one political principle. Obviously, you have a main principle, but you need support from different directions. Having simply one political principle is risky. The project leadership failed to do this in PBMR, relying politically on a single, albeit very strong minister, but his fate, his political fate was linked to that of his principal, the president of the day. When the president resigned, the minister resigned, and everything went down the plug. In the SKA and the RCP, many lines upward, as I've explained, have been established. Department of Communications, DERCO, Department of Energy for RCP, etc. Having the right culture in any high-tech project is extremely important. What you need primarily, in my view, in a high-tech project is a careful, rigorous engineering culture, rather than primarily a carelessly brilliant science culture or a military gung-ho culture. If, as I said a few minutes ago, if every brilliant scientific idea is heeded, no concrete will ever be poured. Of course, new science can shake the foundations of a project, If it's disruptive, if there's something new that's happened and you still continue doing the old thing, your project's worth nothing. But there need to be very good reasons for changing an engineering game plan. Often strong contributors towards high-tech projects, and we find this also in SKA and Meerkat, etc., have a military technology background. This is both good and bad. It's good from the perspective that the level of precision and technical competence is usually assured. But the military is also an environment where the fundamental urgency of the mission is seen to trump everything else. Regulators are seen as subordinate beings. But in the civilian world, regulators have it in their power to slow projects down interminably, whether it's through EIAs or through nuclear safety authorities. So caution and politeness should be the order of the day when dealing with regulators. Now, the responsibility to direct organizational culture resides at leadership level. And there's a delicate balance, as I've been explaining, between getting the job done at all costs, which is the military approach, doing the job right, doing it correctly, which is an engineering approach, and doing the right job, which is science. Balancing these three tendencies and competencies has to be top of mind for every leader of a high-tech project. Let me just... Partnerships. Sorry, I couldn't see my own screen for a second there. Don't be too greedy. Greed manifested by trying to dominate in a project is a cardinal sin. Respect your partners. In the SKA, the balance of interests works more naturally, given the fact that with membership of the SKA came both rights and responsibilities. It's not in the interest of this project to let the costs blow up, but you also need to ensure that all members are more or less happy with the deal that they've been handed. And whether it's in terms of the science proportion of viewing time, fair work return, etc. In the PBMR, this was mismanaged because South Africa didn't want to share the dividends deriving from what was seen as largely locally developed intellectual property. So it ended up taking on all the risks. When there was a political shift, that risk was seen to be too large and the project was cancelled. In the Reactor Conversion Project, there were several partners, not all of whom had the same objectives, but fortunately those objectives were not incompatible. I mean, you had the South African government, you had Nexus itself, you had the US National Nuclear Security Agency, the IAEA. Not all of them wanted the project to succeed for the same reasons, but those reasons were compatible. The IAEA wanted to promote the contribution of nuclear technology to global health enhancement. The South African government wanted to promote South Africa as a producer of disruptive technology and to encourage NEXA as a generator of foreign exchange. The US government wanted to promote technologies that were compatible with their stringent post-911 nuclear safeguards requirements. Leading the project successfully involved making everyone feel that they got what they wanted. So that's my 6 lessons for you. Thanks for listening, and there is the link to the actual article upon which this colloquium talk was based as my last slide, and I'm now available for questions. Oleg, shall I stop sharing the screen, or do you want me to keep it up there?
You might want to refer back to some slides during questions.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rob. I've got some questions, but maybe someone else wants to go first. If just open your microphone and speak or raise a hand. So Simon.
Thanks for your talk, Rob. So it seems, I guess, over the past 20 years, nuclear has been in the doldrums, or just there hasn't been a lot of public support for it, which I think is a pity. do you ever see it kind of getting back on the wagon?
You're talking about South
respect to
Africa,
things like-
Simon. You're talking about South Africa, Simon, or globally?
Maybe globally, because I mean, I'm also aware of things like thorium nuclear, and you know, nuclear has evolved since the 60s and 50s in Chernobyl, for example.
Look, I think that with the urgency that climate change brings, having a baseload electricity generation technology which is not carbon intensive will make nuclear more compelling. I mean, you're already seeing reactor projects in countries which have not been nuclear in the past. I mean, Hungary, Poland, Romania, all going nuclear. There's been in some countries, of course, a backsliding. I mean, France, for example, has not completed a nuclear project in decades, although they will pretty soon in Brittany. In South Africa, you know, as you know, we were very well on the way towards embarking on a big new build, and then it stopped. I at this stage, given the high capital costs of nuclear, I see it as unlikely, unless we go into what's termed in the construction industry as a BOOT, a build, own, operate, transfer, you know, where the vendor does the construction, operates the plant for an agreed tariff for an agreed period of time, makes an agreed profit margin, and then hands it over to the host country. That's one way to do it. But I'm not sure that the South African government would want to hand its nuclear toys over to foreigners for 20 years, which is what it would take. Yeah? But yeah, no, I think that I mean, I made my comments about South Africa, but globally, I think there is a nuclear revival. I mean, China, for example, has a very strong program. Russia has never stopped. Even the US, I think, is coming back, particularly, although I think they've lost the preeminent position that they had in terms of large reactors. They've made a very strong push for small modular reactors. You know, the ones 10 megawatt ones that are based originally on submarine technology, which you can just go and put down in some place for 30 years and come back and pick it up again and take it away. You know, there's no refueling necessary at all. Just as in a submarine can stay out of water for 30 years, you know, without needing to refuel. So yeah, I have quite an optimistic picture for nuclear globally, but not quite so much in our country.
Okay, thank you.
Right. More questions? I've got a couple of questions, slightly different ones. So Rob, you mentioned the Safari reactor to start. I was just intrigued about the history of that because you said it was donated by Eisenhower under the Atoms for Peace program. And yet, from the context, you were talking about weapons-grade uranium. So I guess I'm just a little bit ignorant of South Africa's nuclear weapon history here. Was that the reactor used to produce weapons-grade uranium for the nuclear program?
No, I mean, look, it's interesting that this happened almost, the reactor was constructed just before sanctions and the anti-apartheid movement would have blocked it. So at that stage, I guess as a kind of a global apology for dropping the bomb on 2 Japanese cities, the US government under Eisenhower embarked on a very comprehensive program of providing research reactors to a range of countries. I mean, you would not believe this today, but there's still a reactor with some weapons-grade, small amounts of weapons-grade uranium in it in Kinshasa, in the DRC. There are reactors all over the world. And one of the programs initiated by Obama was to essentially take back the weapons-grade uranium from all these reactors. Now, in our case, we had our own uranium enrichment program. Originally built, I guess, to cater for the weapons strategy at the time, the so-called Y plant at Pelindaba, later augmented by the Z plant, which produced fuel for Coburg when Eskom couldn't get nuclear fuel on the global market because of sanctions. So what happened was that even though there were safeguards inspections which were conducted by the IAEA at Pelindaba outside Pretoria, a large amount of that material was nevertheless diverted into the weapons program. So under the picture this, there were sanctions in place, so we couldn't buy nuclear fuel on the global market. So we said, okay, instead of buying it, we're going to make it. And so under the cloak of producing fuel for Safari, they ran a weapons program. So it was in a way, the sanctions shot itself in the foot by creating a smokescreen for a weapons program.
Right.
Then in 1992, I think it was, then President de Klerk announced the weapons program, and he announced it only after all the weapons had been decommissioned under the auspices of the IAEA. And so that weapons-grade uranium was then sequestered at NEXA, and it is inspected regularly by the agency, by the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's under proper safeguards. But we were using that material to make medical radioisotopes with. And at a certain point, obviously, since we had a limited number of nuclear devices, we would have run out of it, and no one would supply that to you because it goes now against international conventions. You don't just trade in weapons-grade uranium. So the Obama drive towards converting all reactors to low-enriched, all research reactors to low-enriched uranium, that fitted in with our own perspective that we actually needed to move away from weapons grade because we were running out of the material anyway. So I don't know whether that's a kind of a roundabout way of answering your question.
No, yeah, it fills in all the background. Thanks. There's some discussion I see on the chat of solar versus nuclear, but it's just comments, it's not really a question. I had a different question on the Pebble Bed. You offered to explain why it's intrinsically thermally stable, and that got my curiosity going.
Okay.
And what's that picture? You had a picture in the top right of the slide when you were talking about the Pebble Bed.
I think it was a picture of the reactor itself, I think.
No, there was like something being manufactured on a table, but some.
I'll have a look now. Yeah. No, I mean in any nuclear reactor, you've got a reaction with U-235 embedded in U-238. You have a competing fission on the one hand. Uranium-235 fissions, produces neutrons. Those neutrons can go on and fission other U-235 nuclei, or they can get absorbed by U-238, thereby quenching the reaction. Because if you have too many absorbed by 238, then not enough go on to fission 235, and so the reaction slows down. Now, in any nuclear reactor, this happens as the temperature goes up, and the reason that it happens increasingly with increasing temperature is because of Doppler broadening of spectral lines thermally. Right. So that the U-238 capture line starts to overlap with the U-235 capture, or the U-235 fission. So gradually, because there's much more U-238 than 235, the U-238 takes over. But in a conventional pressurized water reactor or any large commercial reactor, that temperature of the quenching happens way beyond the fuel failure temperature. But in the PBMR, the power density is designed so that the reaction quenches before the fuel fails. So
okay. Right. So the thermal feedback is negative from as it gets hotter, the reaction quenches. Okay. Yes. That's probably related. I see John posted a question in chat. He said, with a disclaimer that I know basically nothing about nuclear reactors, why the drive to build a Pebble Bed reactor despite safety concerns, including an inability to properly monitor the core in real time. But I guess you partially explained that just now. It's designed to be safe, right?
The monitoring of the core was actually one of the key problems in the in tray of the chief technology officer. And the regulator obviously wants you to measure the temperature. They don't just want you to model it. And the very Pebble technology, can you imagine this core of almost like billiard ball size spheres of graphite slowly rolling through the reactor, coming in the one side and out the other side. And can you imagine that how difficult it is, given the packing of those spheres, to put any probe in? So the French had a competing design of using prisms as opposed to pebbles. And so you can easily, between various channels of prisms, fit a temperature probe in, because the prisms are then moving in straight lines. Whereas you have this chaotic situation of all of these pebbles together, and how do you put the probe in? So anyway, this was an issue that they were attempting to deal with. But I disagree that it's unsafe, the Pebble Bed technology. I mean, it's designed to be safe. There's no, it's catastrophe free. So you still have obviously the waste to deal with, which is the second nuclear challenge. But having a catastrophe free technology, generation technology, is a good thing, obviously.
Right.
So you said there was a comment about, I haven't really gone to the chat. Said there's a question.
I can ask a question also about the Pebble Bed, just in terms of all the research that went on and all the IP that was developed. Is there still potential with that IP in terms of could that go on to actually, if it's taken further, could that be developed into a commercial device or entity at the end? So somebody,
curated.
If you were to sell it or pass it on, etc., what's the potential?
I think at this stage, the IP, to the best of my knowledge, is being curated by SCIMP. It's been maintained and the patents resecured, etc., etc. One of the challenges is that now China has commissioned its first PBMR. It's running as we speak from the last couple of weeks. One of the possibilities would have been, if there had been a nuclear build program in South Africa, to partner with them, where, I mean, for example, they had made larger strides at that point when we were talking of a nuclear build program on the reactor, and on the other hand, we had made large strides on the fuel. So there could well have been a partnership. At this stage, I don't know. I think it would require significant co-investment by an international technology partner. But yes, I think that the IP would have to go with people, because you need people to interpret it. Just handing over boxes of documents is not going to do it. It will need some transfer of human beings with it for it to really work properly.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? Did you happen to find that picture, Rob? I think it was on your slide where you introduced the Pebble Bed, like 2 or 3 slides in.
Where are we now?
Slide.
That one.
No. So you had, at some point, you started showing little pictures in the top right. Yeah, no, that's...
These were just little things from Creative Commons.
Ah, okay.
No, they don't mean anything.
Okay. No, there was another one with an object on a table. Yeah, that one there, I think. Yeah.
This.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the Jülich prototype is the photograph.
Right.
And then the top right is nothing. The top right is just some CAD CAM 3D printed thing. You know, so there's nothing.
Okay, maybe,
It's just
maybe it's just a bicycle helmet.
Sorry, it's sorry to distract you.
Right.
Anyway, see if anyone can guess this. What is the only power generation technology which ultimately does not derive from a nuclear origin? There's only one.
From a nuclear, you mean as a nuclear?
Well,
nuclear
so
fission.
solar is nuclear because of the fusion reaction in the sun.
Right. So not fusion, not fission.
I'd say hydropower.
No, the water is lifted up by the sun.
Oh yeah.
Tidal.
Tidal's the
Yeah,
one. Tidal's the only
right.
one.
Yeah, that's sheer gravity.
Yep. And as my son points out to me, nuclear is actually a renewable resource, but you just have to wait around for the next neutron star merger or supernova to get more uranium.
Yeah, true. On cosmological scales, it's quite renewable.
Yeah.
Excellent. Do we have any more questions? Any more questions? Any more raised hands? Well, we're at the end of the hour anyway, so it's well timed. Let's all thank Rob again.
Thanks for listening, guys and girls.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time, Rob. Great. And we'll see, I guess we'll see some of you, most of you next week.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks a lot, Rob. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Oleg. Thanks for inviting me.
It was very good to have you.